This tank chat's going to be about these two vehicles, the Scimitar and Scimitar 2. Now we're here at Bovington, bit of a nippy day. If you've seen already, David Fletcher has done a number of tank chats on what we know as the CVRT family. That's Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance Tracked. A series of vehicles that we always tend to look at the Scorpion as being the main parent vehicle, but was put into service with the British Army in the 1970s, still in service with a number of armies around the world. I'm going to look at one of those variants, but it's still worth going back a little bit to have a look at how CVRT came into service.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
Now, back in World War II, we've got wheeled reconnaissance vehicles like the Dingo, the Daimler armoured car. We've also got tracked armour being used for reconnaissance. They even use Cromwell tanks as reconnaissance in some of the armoured divisions. So we're used to the idea of having two types of reconnaissance vehicles for the British Army. Now, in the 1950s, into service goes FV701 Ferret, then FV601 Saladin. Now again, wheeled, but with slightly different roles. Ferret, small, nippy, light, the idea of gathering information without really being seen. Saladin has got fairly big punch on it, that 76mm gun they give it, and that idea that it can fight for some of the information as well. But even as they're going into service in the 50s, the British Army starts looking at what's going to come next. What's the next replacement generation for reconnaissance vehicles? And General Service Requirement, or GSR 1106, lists what the Army is going to want as a replacement vehicle. And on that list, they put things such as, it's got to be air portable. This is still Britain at end of Empire days. We've still got troops based in the Far East, Middle East, etc. Air portability is going to be important to get vehicles and soldiers to places quickly should they be needed. They're also looking at amphibious, and the British Army go through a phase where lots of vehicles are made to float, just like the DD did in World War II. Amphibious is one of those capabilities. Later actually gets dropped off most of the CVRT family. What else are they looking for? High mobility. They want those vehicles to be fast. They need them to be very quick, mobile. And they also want to give them some sort of firepower over and above just a machine gun. If you think of the Dingo, Bren gun if you were lucky, actually they want to give them a bit more bite. Not necessarily up to the level of Saladin, but perhaps 76, but a range of weaponry that is going to at least match the type of reconnaissance vehicles they might be bumping into coming the other way. That was a general rule of thumb. So wheels or tracks. They look at this as a problem. They give it to, as we've talked about before, Chertsey. This time it was called the Fighting Vehicle Research and Development Establishment based up at Chertsey. Sometimes we use the phrase Chobham, same sort of place. They're given the task there of developing these ideas, and they do a series of experiments, they do a series of investigations into what might be possible. And it becomes clear that to do the job that the reconnaissance vehicles are expected to do, you're going to go back to having two types. So we're going to have a tracked vehicle and a wheeled vehicle. And again, when you think about it, tracked vehicles, you're more likely to be able to keep up with your tracked tanks and AFVs. Wheeled vehicles, they've got advantages, quicker on the road, speedier, sometimes less threatening if they're going to be used for internal security duties, other things that way. So different ways of looking, but they are very keen for this idea that we're going to have two types going into service, a tracked version and a wheeled version. And that leads to the idea of combat vehicle reconnaissance tracked, CVRT, but there's also combat vehicle reconnaissance brackets W, wheeled, and that becomes Fox later on. Now, in 1961, Director Royal Armoured Corps, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Simpkin, MC, he puts out a plan for the next 15 years of British Army vehicles, and in that the core vehicle is going to be this new family. At the time, they're calling it Lightweight Air Portable, AFE. And again, it goes through a series of different abbreviations, different times. AP, AFE, it's called at one point. They recognise the fact that those two types are going to be needed. And then they come up with this idea, LHHTVF, Light Family of High Mobility Track Vehicles. The names get all rather confusing as they go through that developmental period. But basically, you're going to end up with this two families, FE100, CVRT, and what becomes a wheeled version, Fox. Now, Chobham or Chertsey, where they're doing this initial development work, because of these requirements of the Army, they specifically look at a light aluminium alloy. Now, it's already being used on vehicles. Think of the American M113. They're looking at this with an idea of keeping the weight down for air portability. Ultimately, CVRT, you can fit two of them in a C130 Hercules. That's why they're going for lightweight and a small size, not just because you're going to be that target on the battlefield, but the lighter you are, the likelihood is also we can give you more speed because you're not having to get too much tonnage around the place. So they're looking as well at hydropneumatic suspension. In the end, this becomes too risky, not a mature enough technology at the time, and in the end the CVRT family goes back to being fitted with torsion bar suspension. But they're looking at these different avenues of experimentation to put together on this new type of vehicle. It's going to have low weight, only 84 inches wide, and that, when you think about as well, part of this, there's different reasons. Yes, air portability, but they did at one point as well look at the idea if it's going to have to go out to places like Malaya, other places, fit down plantation trackways, etc. So that narrowness of the vehicle was quite important. Got a float, and they want to get the ground pressure on the lighter type of track they want to fit there down to about 5 pounds a square inch. Now that's roughly what a fully kitted out soldier, his ground pressure under his boot. So that's what they're aiming for as well, to get the ground pressure underneath one of these new vehicles to be the same ground pressure as a soldier with his kit on. Now they're looking to give this vehicle a name. They follow with the idea of the S family from Saladin, Saracen, etc. And they carry on with the S idea. On this time, the first time round, they're going to call what was going to become Scorpion Setter after the dog. Not that aggressive sounding, etc. Scorpion seems better. And the general service requirement is looking not just at one type of recce vehicle, but a whole family of them. So we then end up with not just Scorpion, but with a missile firing Striker. You've got Spartan, the APC version, Samaritan as an ambulance, Sultan, the command version, Samson, the armoured recovery vehicle. General service requirement added to. So originally, this vehicle behind me, so Scimitar, is not on the list, but it's added later. They now want the same hull as Scorpion, but a different turret, the same turret that they're going to fit on the Fox wheeled reconnaissance version. And that turret will be carrying a 30mm Graden cannon. Christmas 1965, TV 15,000 is driven out for the first time, and that's kind of, you might say, the testbed vehicle that you're looking at, that is one of those vehicles that's shown off. When you see it for the first time, you can see it's that embryonic Scorpion vehicle that we're going to see later on, and that's shown around the place in various photographs, etc. They go to Alvis sometime later. Alvis has made cars, family cars, 20s and 30s, gets involved with Nicholas Strausler at the end of the 30s, does a couple of armoured vehicles for him. World War II, mainly associated with making aero engines and aeroplane parts, but after World War II, it's one of the companies gone to produce the prototype Saladin. So they're looking at moving into the armoured vehicle game. Their approach to come up with the prototype versions of what's going to become Scorpion and then the CVRT family. January 1969, they've got their first vehicle comes out their factory that's sent off, Abu Dhabi, Australia, heat tests. Another versions go off out to Canada for the snow, Norway as well. 17 prototypes are done in 6 variants by about May 1970. Out of that, the Army then accepts what Alvis are doing. We think we've now got a new design that's going to be acceptable across that Ranger family, including Scimitar. So October 1970, the Army accepts for the first time, and the very first vehicle, Remy, actually take one on board in 1972, is actually so that they then are starting to be made and manufactured en masse, proper production vehicles. So they start producing them by about the mid-1970s, about 40 a month are coming out the Alvis factory up at Coventry. The RAF in 1979 also puts in an order. They're going to have 150 of them for the RAF regiment, which again is looking at airfield defence. If the Cold War had come, Harrier jump jets in improvised airfields around the place in Europe, so they needed protection. So again, RAF are going to take these on board, and in the end the British Army actually order about 1,863 CVRT vehicles. Of that, 334 of them are Scimitars. So what was this new variant, the Scimitar, for? Well, for what they thought as medium reconnaissance tasks, that could be up to even 20 kilometres ahead of a main armoured division. That's what they thought they were going to use the Scorpion for. But for closer in reconnaissance duties, up to about 3 kilometres away from your parent unit, the battle group, etc., that's when you'd be using the Scimitar. With its 30mm Raden cannon as a level of protection, or if needed, aggressive firepower. Now that 30mm Raden, that's the difference, of course. The Raden is actually put together Royal Armaments Development Establishment and Enfield Lock, where they were being made, and long history, obviously Enfield rifles there, etc. The 2 pins together, 2 words together joined, makes Raden. So what they've done with that, they've created a 30mm cannon based around the round size from the Hispanio Suiza type of shell, and that was then developed into their own type of ammunition. But the key thing about it, this new type of gun, the Raden, it's got very little recoil inside the vehicle. That's all done outside the vehicle. It's kept very compact and small, and from that point of view, ideal for fitting in what's a very small vehicle, Scimitar. It's also, of course, put on Sabre, another version of the CVRT family that comes later on, and Warrior. And Fox, of course, combat vehicle reconnaissance wheeled. So Fox has it, same turret that then goes on to Sabre later on. Now, that not much recoil inside means, again, you've got more room for the crews there and more other types of stowage. 165 rounds are actually stowed of that 30mm. It goes in clips of 3 rounds, 2 of those clips in each main magazine, so that limits the rate of fire. Also got a coaxial GPMG 762, about 3,000 rounds of ammunition are carried inside the vehicle for that. Range of that Raden about out to about 2,000 yards. It does fire a armour piercing variant as well as a small high explosive one. It's got those different natures of ammunition. They're still actually developing amazingly, because again, Warrior is going to be remaining in service for a small amount of time, used in a recce role, so Raden is actually still in service. And of course, lots of other countries have taken CVRT with that 30mm Scimitar on, so there's still a market for some of that rounds. 4 banks of smoke discharges on the front of the vehicles are actually put there, and the vehicle originally, when it goes into service, it's got something called the number 76 Mark I sight with a 10 times enlargement through that sighting system. Later on, and this is true of the vehicle in a number of areas, there is improvements and changes and upgrades to the vehicle. 1992 Operation Grapple, the British deployment to Bosnia, we end up putting what's called the Spire sight on the front of some of these vehicles. That's got thermal imaging, so it increases the range the commander and the gunner can actually see through. Now, the original version of Scimitar has the famous Jaguar J60 6-cylinder 4.2 litre petrol engine in it. That's the again derivative from the old E-Type that's talked about a lot. Later on in a life extension program in about 2000, those Scimitars were then given a new engine, and that's the Cummins 6BTA 5.9 litre 6-cylinder turbo diesel, giving you about 195 horsepower. 2011, they even increased that engine horsepower as well, 235 horsepower. So what you're really getting again is remembering a very light vehicle, about 8 tons on those earlier models. That vehicle is then powered by a relatively powerful engine, and that gets you around very quickly. So it's a speedy vehicle, 50 miles an hour being recorded, and that was considered a going rate on a Scimitar. So it's actually the fastest production light tank ever made. So, you know, it's quite a nippy bit of kit there. Again, that works perfectly for its reconnaissance role because it doesn't want to be seen. If it is seen, it wants to be there and gone very, very quickly. Now, again, as part of those LEPs, those life extension programs, they end up putting new night vision, Bowman in there. And as they're upgrading these vehicles, it ends up being given a new derivative. It's called Scimitar 235. And that ends up becoming this new version, as it were, of after all the different upgrades. Most of the Scimitar fleet are upgraded to this 235 standard. Now, 2003 Operation Telic gives even more need to add protection. So they put more passive protection on the sides of the vehicle, underneath the hull, for mine blast protection, bar armour, enhanced protection bar armour, or EPBA as it's sometimes called. 146 vehicles were then fitted with a newer type of battlefield thermal imaging sight as well, because these are vehicles that are now operating not just in Iraq, but then later on as well we see vehicles like this being sent as well to Afghanistan. They've also fitted with a lot of theatre entry standard bits of kit, so you'll see them with those IED jammers placed on the front of the vehicle, so for hopefully jamming, interception, any sort of radio messages or signals going to IEDs, i.e. improvised explosive devices by the side of the roads. And there'll be lots of little added gizmos put on the vehicles as we respond to the different levels of threat and different ways the enemy are fighting at the time. They end up with looking at improving the final drives, filters. It increases the weight of the vehicle up to about 11,000 kilograms, but that version has now gone out of service with the British Army. So the last of those CVRT 235 versions, they've gone. They're now taken out, and we now have actually no Scimitars left in British Army service. Now, because of Operation Herrick, that was the British deployment to Afghanistan, in 2010, something called Project Transformer was started. And a vehicle emerges that we call Scimitar 2. In many ways, you might argue it's a completely different vehicle from Scimitar 1. The only similarity is the turret and the weapons system. What the British did was they went to BAE as part of this, it was about a £30 million contract. BAE get the hull of the FV-103, the Spartan, the armoured personnel carrier. They make brand new hulls, they adapt them slightly, and then they put the 30mm Radon cannon in a Scimitar turret, and that's dropped on the top of the Spartan hull. And that creates what becomes known as Scimitar 2, and that's this vehicle here. And the idea there was, because Spartan had a higher volume or higher top level to it, it meant there was more volume inside. That meant that they could suspend the seats from above, which, because if you followed in Afghanistan, IEDs, mines, etc., mine blasts underneath the vehicle, that shock wave could go through the driver's foot or crew member's foot if they're standing on the floor. If you suspend their seats, they won't get such an impact from a mine blast. That vehicle hull gives that room. Now they are brand new hulls. If you look at the rear of them, they've got a much smaller door than the original Spartans. That gives it the vehicle much more solidity there as well. They also make sure that the driving pedals, a number of vehicles that were UORs, urgent operation requirements, going out to Afghan, pedals again are taken off the floor. So again, that sense of any blast, there's very little to go as shock waves straight through the seat, pedals or other instrumentation to the driver or other crew members that way. It's still got that Cummins 6 BTA 5.9 litre turbo diesel in there, now about 235 horsepower. They upgrade the David Brown TN15E transmission system. It's got newer brakes, newer filtration systems fitted to it. Some of them are given some rollover protection systems, or they call them ROPS, like a cage on the top. So should again, whether it's an IED blast or just the scenery they're driving through, if they do turn over, they've actually, the crew members in the turret in the top, if their heads are out or their torsos are out, they've got some sort of rollover protection there, and you'll see that on some of them. They've also got add-on armour, which is, again, some is Kevlar, some is bar armour that's fitted. R1's still got some of the armour that was put on, Israeli type of armour that was there for small arms protection. The bar armour's come off of this particular vehicle, and that bar armour was really anti-RPG. That was its main function there. Scimitar 2 also fitted to have an air conditioning unit. Unlike Scimitar 1, it didn't have an MBC kit there, but what they've done is, because they're doing this specifically for Operation Herrick, let's keep the guys inside at a reasonable temperature. So an air conditioning unit is put on the back rear roof there, and to keep the guys inside. So it's got a lot of changes to it in many ways. It's a new hull, same 30mm Radon turret. They start going out to the troops in September of 2011. They were trialled down here at Bovington earlier, up at ATDU. They even looked at one variant of putting the old original Scorpion turret onto the new Spartan hull with a 76mm gun. That doesn't progress into service though. It goes up in weight. You're now looking at a 12-ton looking vehicle with Scimitar 2, and only 30 of them are actually put together for service out in Operation Herrick. When Britain pulls back from Afghanistan, most of those theatre entry standard things are taken off. These vehicles were still used. There's pictures of them. They're on an exercise in Latvia in about 2000. They're now all out of frontline British Army service. In fact, Scimitar 2 and some of the Scimitar 1s, some of those Scimitar 1s were sold, about 123 to Latvia back in 2014. Scimitar 2s like this one, we've acquired this one. Actually, the remainder of the fleet, I think, are up for sale at the moment. Here we are in, as I mentioned, a nippy day in November of 2022. So they're for sale there. Maybe they'll all have been gone by the time you're watching this. So CVRT Scimitar, a great part of that British successful family, CVRT. 4,500 CVRTs were made all told, lots of them sold around the world, many still in service with other armies. 23 countries ended up buying CVRTs, 16 countries still at the moment using them. As I mentioned, so British Army, they've now gone from British Army service, and watch this space, Ajax is the vehicle that's supposed to be replacing them.